Landslides, cyclones and floods, just some of the natural disasters that have smashed New Zealand communities in recent years. The Helen Foundation and WSP have now released a new report looking at how insurance companies might simply retreat from protecting what for many is their most important asset. Business correspondent Katie Bradford sat down with the report's author, Mercier, and started by asking just how bad it could get.
Firstly, I think everyone probably has noticed that their insurance premiums are going up for their household insurance, and part of that is because of inflation and some other reasons, but a big chunk of that price increase is to do with international or global climate change and global warming. So there's a lot more events happening around the world, big disasters happening. Florida's a prime example, but also floods in North Europe. And those pressures are pushing up our insurance premiums. And the report's looking at the fact that over time that is going to get more and more the case, especially for people who are in a flood zone area. They're going to find that their premiums are going up really quickly, really steeply.
And the insurance premiums, as you've said, have gone up 200% basically in the past decade. Look at Wellington, up 29%, Auckland not far behind that. At what point is insurance simply too expensive? Do we cap it? Where do you go?
Yeah, so my taxi driver this morning, for example, was paying $8,000 for his property. It's quite a small property in Wellington. Where is the affordability threshold? That's a brilliant question. And one of the recommendations in the report is that we work out what we think should be a threshold for affordability. So in Australia, for example, they have a way of looking at insurance. They say, well, what's your total income? What's the household income? What's the household paying on insurance? If you're paying more than a month's worth of your income on insurance, then you're under affordability stress, they call it. So I think we need to be thinking about how much is too much within a household and whether we should then subsidise some people to help them keep insurance, because it's really, really important that we maintain high coverage for a whole bunch of different reasons.
Are governments and councils leaving it in the too hard basket because it's too hard?
It is a really hard area of policy and there are no straightforward, simple answers, but there are many different schemes that have been put in place around the world, public insurance schemes for flooding, which have been quite successful, and I think we can learn from some of those. The government isn't currently doing an awful lot on this from what I can understand, but I think now's a really good chance to start looking at that again, because they're currently working on a climate adaptation framework and this is where that would fit.
How would a public insurance scheme work?
Well, for example, it could look at a whole bunch of different ways, but let's look at how they do it in the UK, for example, the flood re scheme there. Private insurers have banded together to create a scheme that protects the top 2% of properties who have top 2% of flood risk properties, and they all put in, everyone in the country puts a little bit of their premium towards that. It costs the country about £10 per policyholder to help subsidise those people who are most at risk. And that seems to work quite well, though there are some things I'd change about that system as well, because it has this unfortunate thing of allowing people to keep rebuilding their houses over and over again rather than making them move on at some point, which I think is a big flaw of that system.
Some insurance providers here are moving towards a risk-based pricing system. Isn't that a fairer one than what you've just talked about, for example?
Yeah, so risk-based premiums are one of the reasons we're going to see prices go up a lot here. In the past, we've had what they call community-based pricing, which means that we all collectively share the risk and we all pay towards everybody's risk, and then that works quite well in the way that we do something quite similar with healthcare, I guess you could say. We all split the costs of that. As to what's fair, I think that's a really complicated and interesting value discussion. Think about climate change. We've all, I guess, contributed a little bit to it, but no one of us is purely responsible for climate change. And yet some people are going to be suffering the brunt of climate change much more than other people. For me, I think of it in terms of equity. There are a lot of poorer communities, for example, where climate change is really going to affect them badly, but yet they're not going to be able to afford insurance premiums. So they kind of get a double whammy. They're going to be sitting there in houses that are not worth much because they can't get insurance, but they won't be able to afford to move because their houses won't be worth anything and because climate change will be flooding them regularly. And so I guess in a way you could say that was entrenching poverty. So is that fair? People are going to have to make decisions about what's fair and put in place policies that reflect that.
Again, on fairness
Yeah.
though, why should people subsidise those who choose to live in a high-risk flood zone? You're making that private decision.
I think it's really important that we don't, from now on, choose to build houses in flood zones. I think it's really important that we have a climate adaptation framework that sets out rules about where people should be able to live and makes really clear decisions about, well, if you've got a risk threshold, maybe you shouldn't build anywhere where there's a 1 in 50 year chance of flood, for example. Just choose a place and have that as the rule. Is it fair? A lot of people bought houses not knowing that they were in flood zones. A lot of people bought houses perhaps knowing that they were, but not really thinking about what that risk meant. I think people are very, very bad at assessing risk, and that's been shown in study after study. So I guess, for me personally, I think blaming people is not going to be the way to go. I think we need to think about what we as a country want to see in terms of equity and fairness and good outcomes for all of us. So we've got a big chunk of people that are not insured. That's going to end up costing us all a whole lot more in terms of social welfare and increasing insurance costs overall and helping people out after a disaster. There's no fair outcome really, I think, whichever way you look at it, because climate change is big and complicated and it's going to be affecting a lot of us in quite a big way quite soon.
And you touched on it, but what happens to people who bought their houses 20, 30, 50 years ago, never expecting them to be in a flood zone or whatever other disaster hits them? What happens to them? I think the French have an example there about, I guess, risk properties. What do you do?
So that's known as legacy risk. Like you bought a house before it was a risk and now you've got the legacy of a great big risk. And my personal feeling is that we should be splitting those risks a bit more evenly across the country, not just saying, well, you hold 10 times more risk than me, therefore you're going to pay 10 times more. I just don't think that that works out being the most equitable solution for New Zealand. So in France, they've got a pretty good insurance system. They've got insurance and reinsurance that's public, and also a proportion of all insurance premiums goes into an adaptation fund as well, called the Mercier fund. So about 12% of your insurance premium gets put aside and that goes towards risk mitigation, so helping councils protect households from flooding, for example. I think that's a really nice model. So in France, it's a community-based scheme, which means everyone splits the cost of floods and helps out those people that are at higher risk.
Where should that balance lie then with some sort of public insurance scheme versus government responsibility and council responsibility? How do you shift that? And private, individual responsibility too.
Yeah. Well, I think when it comes to climate change adaptation, which means mitigating the risks that we have and in some cases planned relocation of houses that are in a very risky area, I think that the central government should be setting the rules for that. So I think we need an act, a piece of legislation which says this is the risk tolerance thresholds that we have. These are the places that urgently need to put in risk mitigation. This is when they need to do it by, and these are how the decisions will be made. But most importantly, this is who's going to pay for it, right? Because one of the big issues we have at the moment, and it's a political hot potato, is who's going to pay for all of this? It's not cheap. It would be
no one wants to pay for it.
No one wants to pay for it. But it's going to be more expensive if we just sit back and wait for the next disaster. We need to be putting in place risk mitigation that's, I think, something like 10 times more cost efficient than just waiting for a disaster to happen. So, yes, I think central government should be helping out with that, because I think a lot of local councils are simply not going to be able to pay for the risk mitigation that they need to put in place. They're not going to be able to pay for planned relocation of whole communities in some cases. If the central government does not pay for it, we're going to end up with essentially ghettos almost of, we're going to have communities that just can't afford to move, that can't get insurance, that are just getting hit time and time again with floods, and that's not what, no one wants to see that.
On that then, are councils doing enough to stop building in flood zones? We've seen since the Auckland floods less than 2 years ago, I think about 1,500 homes have already been built on floodplain areas. How do you stop them doing that? Should they stop doing that?
Yeah, so I think councils are a little bit, often get told off about this, but I don't think it's necessarily always their fault. Quite often councils will say, no, you can't build here, and then developers will actually really persist and take them to court in some cases to try and build where they want to build. So I think councils need more powers to be able to say, actually, no, you can't build here, or actually you can build here, but here are the conditions under which you do it. You have to build 1 metre in the air, for example, and I think developers shouldn't be able to push back against that in the same way that they currently are. So the government's working on a new national policy statement for natural hazards, and that would be a good place to think about how we ensure that councils actually have a bit more control here. And the second thing I would say is that I think there's a real benefit for insurance companies or insurance experts to be able to input into the consenting process. I think if you're saying I'm going to build 100 houses here, then you should have to show one way or another that that area is actually going to be insurable in 20, 30, 40 years.
And given the large-scale changes we're seeing to the RMA and to various building and consenting laws, how much priority should be given to this? And do you think it's even been thought about at the moment?
I think that the climate adaptation side of this is being thought about, and I think we need to get that right to keep premiums accessible and affordable for as long as possible. I think one thing that we've got stuck on is how it will be funded, and I think we have to make those decisions really quickly because we're not doing enough. The Climate Change Commission has been very clear that we're not doing enough to get ready for climate change. We have to up our game there really quickly, or our insurance premiums are going to be out of control really fast, and some would say, you know, they're already heading down that road.
Could those setting up, if a public insurance scheme was set up, could that encourage people to build in those hazardous areas because they've got that backing, right?
Yes, and we've seen that with some of the international schemes. So you have to design the scheme in such a way, and I'm a policy nerd, so I'm very convinced that policy can be designed in such a way that that doesn't happen. We need to make sure that people also are not rebuilding time and time again. So we need to say, yes, we'll offer public insurance, but we're not going to allow people to build in certain places, and we are not going to allow people to rebuild over and over again. There's a great example from America where one house has rebuilt 34 times in 32 years. Every time it's flooded, it is rebuilt, and the public insurance covers that cost. Well, that's ludicrous. We don't want that to be happening here. We have to design so that that is not a possibility. Yeah.
Is that happening here at all? Do you know?
Rebuilds over and over? Well, no, because we've got private insurance here, so the private insurers at some point would say, well, I'm not paying for that anymore, or I will insure you, but with an excess of $100,000, or I'm only going to insure you for $1 million, and then that's it, you're not getting any more out of us. So currently, I don't think that's happening here.
And you've suggested a working group be set up, an advisory group set up to take a look at this. If that happens, and if they were to make any recommendations, where is the law best suited for changes? Is it under the Resource Management Act? Is it in various acts? You know, how do you make sure you're getting that right, consistent approach across what is really various pieces of legislation?
Well, I think the Treasury would be primarily responsible for the policy work around a new public insurance system, but there are other government agencies which would have a say over different aspects of our recommendations. So, for example, we've recommended that insurance companies should be much more transparent about how they do pricing. So at the moment, they can put your prices up and say it's because you're in a flood zone, but they're not required to explain how they came to that conclusion. Perhaps you then say, well, I'm going to put my floor up a metre, what's my premium now? And they might say, well, it's the same. And so you've got no recourse to say, well, actually, that's not fair. So that kind of thing would come under the Financial Markets Authority. The Reserve Bank also has a little say on how insurance companies on their fiscal sustainability. So there's lots of different agencies which have a say over it. Commerce Commission also is relevant because I think one of the things we're facing is a very small non-competitive insurance market here. It would be great to see more people coming into the market, and that would be the Commerce Commission to look at that.
How quickly could whole suburbs or parts of the country just become uninsurable?
Well, depends on the research that you look at, but some research that was done recently by Climate Signal has suggested that within 10 years some areas might be seeing partial, and within 15 years full retreat in some areas. So a lot depends on the extent of climate change, how fast, whether we get the emissions down or not. Depends on some areas. Sea level rise is going up very quickly, and other areas it's actually going down because the land's going up. So different parts of the country will be affected in very different ways. And I recommend you do a bit of Googling about your own property to see whether you're in any danger. But yes, we could be seeing tens of thousands of homes uninsurable within 15 years very easily, I think.
And what's the cost of that to people having to leave their homes, retreat?
Well, the cost is really unthinkable for the families that are involved. Fiscal impacts for the Crown could be pretty huge as well if property markets start seeing big bottoming out for a big chunk of the society. So I think we really need to front foot this, and we need to be putting in place policies now, immediately, so that when insurance retreat starts to happen at a fast rate, we're ready.
Do you have confidence we can get this right? You can see 12, 13 years on from the Christchurch earthquake, there are still people battling council and government and developers and insurance companies. 2 years on from the Auckland anniversary flood, same thing.
Yep.
Are we going to get this right?
I think we will have to muddle through. We will have to find a way to get this right, more or less. We're human beings, so we probably won't get it right 100%. But even if 60% of the things I've talked about in the report happen, then we'll be in a much better position than we are today.